telling the God. Telling the God.
The notion, at least, after all that darkness, is that in order to arrive here, it would require a little persistence, a little endurance, maybe even a little bit of obsessiveness, all of which I think are pretty good qualities when it comes to putting the creative process to work. And that's who I really want to reach out to today. Those of you who are terribly creative, and not only creative by instinct, but creative by practice as well, who are interested in engaging a big project. And while I certainly would believe that almost everyone is creative, given the opportunity to flex that extraordinary quality, it's much rarer to find those who put those energies in pursuit of a big project. Because whatever shape it may take, it is still extremely difficult. And I don't really have any answers as to why we endure that adventure. And I think because the answers are multitude. There, it's complex. It's spectral. You know, one of the elements that probably we can all agree on is that it allows for a unique kind of connection, a connection that is internal for the artist and internal as well for the one experiencing what that artist has brought forth. And in that sense, there's a real a remarkable sense of connection, which we can certainly experience elsewhere, but can be so gratifying and fortifying when we do it through the experience of another's artistic expression. And I think we can agree that there's many ways that we can feel that connection. We can feel that question through elation, euphoria, the kind of joy that we don't need an artistic expression even as an intermediary, where we fall in love, where we make love, where we enjoy the heights of an experience, and we can also find connection in sorrow as we suffer through difficulties and tragedies, when we know grief to its fullest, when we know loss, when we experience shadows, when we experience the murk, when we fall into our own zones of depression and seizure, all of those, and those are just a few. Those experiences help us when we are exposed to someone attempting to articulate that, whether textually or visually or through music. We feel a sense of connection. But there's also another thing that I think is important to emphasize, especially when you're on that path towards exerting yourself towards something that's extremely complex and trying, is that there is a connection, especially among artists, with failure. And I think in many ways that the creative process is about a constant engagement with failure. And I mean this capital F. I mean this almost in a formal way. And I mean to bring it up in some ways to disarm its potency. Often when we experience failure, we find ourselves paralyzed, shocked by the experience, and it makes it difficult to carry on. And part of the reason for that is that we tend to load it up with too much other stuff that's connected to our ego, our expectations, the highly erroneous notion that others are not experiencing that. And what I would like to say is that if you're not failing, you're really not working hard enough. Because failure is an everyday experience, an everyday part of the creative experience, in very much the same way that athletes can work towards failure, where literally their muscles begin to exhaust themselves to the point where they can't continue. This is not something you can do always. But it is part of pushing beyond that pleasant plateau towards real gains. And the same is true of the creative process, of exhausting your synaptic efforts, of exhausting the impulses and scenarios in your head, of taking those leaps that require great energy and result in great exhaustion. And so this is a sort of backhanded way of saying that if you feel that, if you can recognize that your failure is not a denunciation of yourself, but rather an affirmation that you are truly engaged in an important process, then you can see that you are really putting in the work. That failure is a sign that you are continuing on as you should be. So what I'm really dispensing with is this notion that when you're writing, when you're painting, when you're composing music, that what ratifies that experience is your sense of elation at the end, is not in fact correct. And that we begin to understand that feeling overwhelmed is that, and feeling tried is actually a good thing. And so I'm doing this at the start of the year because I did want to urge many of you who perhaps have been somewhat misled that when you are experiencing a sense of doubt and fatigue and whatnot, that you may view that as something indicative of a lack of success or whatnot. And in fact, it's to say the opposite. It's to say that pretty much every day when I'm working, whether I am occasionally visited by the angels of euphoria or sorrow or whatnot, every day there is a sense of incompleteness, a sense of not being able to reach what I'm reaching for, of not being able to continue, of not being able to assemble in a way that reflects accurately what that area beyond articulation seems to provoke in me. And that in many ways, writers and creators have this bond of that they have endurance, and they have persistence, and they can continue to last and outlast that experience of failure. And in some ways, it's similar to social reform. Every time one attempts to move in a direction that's progressive, that aids others in a pursuit of happiness and goodness, it can all feel like a failure, and yet you go at it day in and day out in small measures. For me, it tends to be word count, and then suddenly a story emerges, a book emerges, a big project begins to have the shape of something unto itself that actually might even point towards completion. And the same is with reform, right? We attempt these small gestures, we attempt to communicate these small things, and every day it feels already vanquished and incomplete. And yet, with that persistence can also grow true and lasting change. And that's what all creators are in the pursuit of. And so I just wanted to wish all of you who are struggling along that path to recognize that your struggle is part of the process, and it's probably the most authentic sign you have that you are on that road, that you are traveling at least on the road that I'm traveling on. And it's good to see you, and it's good to know that you're out there. Question of what's happening now. So let's see. In terms of the familiar, will it continue? Well, I think about it often, probably too often. See previous comments to know where my heart is on that subject. And the characters are certainly very alive in my mind, as the world is, as their world is. Will it continue in the same form? I can't see a way of that happening. The intensity which was required, not to mention the resources of publishing 2 volumes nearly every year, is unlikely to be repeated. And I do have to say that I remain extremely close and supportive of my publisher, Pantheon. They did everything to help put out the books in the volumes in the way they did, and did a masterful job. I mean, they've been beautifully published, and but that's actually not the most difficult hurdle, and I think I hear this reiterated here, and that it's really, you can do it in an electronic version and whatnot. The real cost of those books was actually writing them, was producing them. The actual publication of them is small compared to the amount of hours that were required by me and others. Again, the real matter was that we unfortunately did not reach the audience that we needed to support such a project. Now, does that mean the project is dead? No, it actually, for me, what it does is it raises the bar in terms of how to re-express that story. And the truth is that as of now, I've completely failed in that department. I have not understood yet how to achieve the music that would be necessary to sort of compress that story into a different format. And I'm not talking about paper versus digital. I'm talking about how that story would be expressed. For those of you who know it well, it takes up sort of the granular look of time. Everything happens unfolds at a sort of a real-time pace, if you will. So the question then, is it possible to tell this immense story that would have taken another 17 volumes, no, 22 volumes, in a way that maybe could be told in one volume or just a few? And that requires a different narrative voice. And that is something I do think about. And maybe, maybe it's the way is of approaching it is not through a question of totality, but through a question of just a part. And maybe one could take inspiration from the kind of work that Tolkien was doing for Silmarillion, and then later, out of that immense, imaginative world, he created something as simple and enduring as The Hobbit. So is there a smaller story that could be told within the universe of the familiar? Long story short, I'm still thinking about it and exploring possibilities, but I have not come up with a way yet to achieve that. I'm still looking for the right music. In terms of House of Leaves, it is still out there. There are wonderfully talented individuals who continue to express interest in transforming it into another medium. Will that happen? It's much too early to say, but it's certainly exciting to rub shoulders now and then with these immensely talented and accomplished individuals. And so I certainly will let you know if something more significant takes place. Only Revolutions, well, I think you all know that I love that book. My dream for Only Revolutions remains that it's adapted into a ballet. I've always thought it would be an extraordinary ballet, and you could imagine it with sort of a vast stage with screens set up behind it, reflecting 200 years of American history, while this beautiful, intimate pas de deux took place before it, with choreographed in a way that would show the sort of the history of dance mapped out on the history of the United States and the world, and obviously propelling that love story deep into the future that we don't know about yet. And so that brings us to where I'm at now. In 2020, I began and completed a draft on a new novel. It's not related to The Familiar or House of Leaves or whatnot, though there is some connective tissue with those previous works. It was something that I wanted to do very much on my own, without any sort of apparatus that had become part of the familiar, even the little blue kite, even to some degree, the 50-year sword. I wanted to start this journey, at least, in complete isolation. Though, as one learns with such journeys, suddenly travelers appear, and they walk beside you, and they help you, and that certainly has been happening more and more of late, and I'm grateful to those people. At the end of 2020, I had a substantial draft, and then I began the most important process, that of rewriting. I was under the erroneous pressure, under the erroneous impression that I could finish the rewrite in a matter of months. In fact, it took me all of 2021 to get through half of it. Now, you may see something like this, or this. And what that indicates is that I managed to make it through 1/5 of the rewrite, or 2/5 of the rewrite. And should I post a similar looking image, you'll know exactly where I am in that rewrite. Now, that rewrite, as I was saying at the very beginning, it makes makes all the more apparent what an engagement with failure creating is, because you are constantly exhausted by the familiarity of what you've been working on, by the complexity that a previous draft imposes upon you. You can no longer freewheel across the page and let your imagination run this way and that way, because as you're creating something new within the context of that draft, you now have to make sure that it doesn't contradict many other things. It makes sense in terms of the music of that draft, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, it is far more exhausting. It is far more taxing on your imagination, and yet you constantly have to push towards that edge. Is it satisfying? Extremely. There is a satisfaction in that kind of formal failure. It's the same feeling that you would have after a very strenuous workout. You are involved to the maximum with what you are doing. And that is the great intrinsic pleasure of this project, is that as it's gained more mass, I have become, wholly bound to it. And questions of its success, its significance, whether it can play a part in the cultural conversation, vanishes, because all that matters is this particular work. And that is exactly where I'm living now. How much longer will it take? Not an infinite amount of time. At this rate, I should finish this second draft by, I'd say the end of the summer. Maybe that's a little optimistic, maybe not. And then a third draft will be a bit quicker, though I did say that about the second draft. And after that, I will be sending a copy to my editor. After that, there will actually be a few people who can finally read what I have been exhausting myself over. Anyway, I feel extremely privileged and fortunate to be able to spend this kind of time and energy on such a project, something that I'm in essence just making up. And can I tell you anything more about it? I will tell you that it is a Western. And I will tell you something else, that it does take place in Utah. As some of you may know, I moved to Utah when I was 10. It was 1976, 1977, and I lived there until I left for college, which was in 84. And for whatever reason, I have never really revisited those years or my understanding of that place and my understanding of even the good close friends that I made while I was there, and how it shaped me. And I think for some reason I understood that the time was now to explore those heights, if you will, and lows. And more importantly, to do it in a way that wasn't simply that wasn't a piece of nonfiction, that isn't a piece of reporting. It's not what I do, but a piece of imaginative exaltation. It's a revisitation, perhaps, of a place in order to understand where even there, the imagination, with all its fictive powers, can soar. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, let's say the first 5 people to email Yarn Plus Inc. with a New Year's card in the subject line will receive a New Year's card. And otherwise, maybe we'll try this again, maybe we won't. It was lovely talking to you, and onwards into 2022.